Thanks, Phil, and thanks, Dan and Jim. So the floor is now open. Yes, sir.
Gentlemen, Wyatt Cash with AOL Government. I'm sure you're familiar with the efforts at NIST to put together best practices, a site to catalog many of these efforts. How would you distinguish what you've published today from what NIST has published year to date?
Okay, so a great question, and I'll throw a couple of opening comments, and then in the spirit of collaboration, anybody on the panel who would like to take a crack at it. So philosophically, we obviously had NIST at the table, and their leadership came and actually previewed the recommendations and were actively participated. We took a look at, a lot of the good work that's been done, not only at NIST, but across the board, whether that's with SCAP all the way through FedRAMP, and said, are there application, if, we've already made recommendations that we want to, ensure that we have configuration management all the way down, that we make sure that we have, process for putting metrics around software measurements, which are embodied in some of the programs. And so the starting point was leverage good work that has been done. I think it is the collective wisdom of the panel that there has been some really superb work done, and that we should extend and accelerate, but don't look to try to reinvent where we don't need to, and that was the basis of it. So there was active collaboration with NIST, their leadership. There was foundational looks at the work that's already been done, and there was an attempt to extend it.
If I can add to that, this is Mike Nelson with Georgetown. I've been very supportive of what they're doing at NIST. I think it's incredibly important that we have specific case studies to show just how agencies are adopting the cloud. What we're doing, I think, is providing some guidance on how policies and regulations might be changed so that those case studies aren't so difficult. And that's what they're finding with some of those case studies, is that there are barriers, there are problems, there are standards issues, there are policy regulation issues. We're giving some guidance on how to get past those. But I think that the two efforts fit together perfectly. We're providing a political push and some vision about where we can go. They're providing specifics on what needs to be fixed.
And I would commend NIST, not only in general for their work, but also for the just extraordinary collaboration they had with our effort here. So it was definitely hand in hand. Thanks, Mike. Yes, sir.
Hi, Pat Thibodeau, Computer World. I actually have two questions, but I'll just ask one now. Regarding taking data and moving it overseas. Yep. The trend in government right now has been to ask cloud providers to ensure that the data remains in the U.S. That's both from the state and local government and federal. So you're talking about something called appropriate data that could be moved over. Can you explain just what kind of data that can be moved overseas by the government, why they should even bother doing this? You're framing it in a way that makes it seem like this is a benefit to the industry, not really to the government. And so just put a little clarity around that.
Well, first place, again, I'll give an opening comment and certainly have participation in the group. Let's start at the possible highest level of when you think about, one, obviously we live in a global environment. Secondarily is that when you look at different kinds of applications, you look at different workflows. If you're trying to take, in its simplest form, a price catalog and publish it so anybody can subscribe to it and be able to see a price catalog, that is a workflow which would naturally want to open up to its broadest possible barriers. If you're looking for the ability to do competitiveness on how to do global shipping, you would obviously want to open that workflow up to as many global partners as you can. If you're interested in keeping individual records relevant to health benefits or the health case of a certain individual, you may have a different set of standards. So, foundational view of the cloud is that workflows are not created equal. They are subject to different audiences, and the ability to not try to treat them all as one, and the workflow is directly related to the data underneath it. So closing your borders into saying everything looks as a single entity and all pieces of data have the same level of access is, quite frankly, not very pragmatic. So the example says is let us maximize those workflows. And Ben Franklin used to have this great saying, unfortunately, sense isn't common. By applying common sense to what some of those workflows are, we're able to have the maximum benefit of a broad distribution of these cloud applications, but also using common sense, we're able to isolate the more specific controls where they should be isolated. So I'll pass any other comments. Dan, perhaps you have a comment?
Yeah, Mike gave a good setup. I think what we're really trying to say is don't equate physical location solely as the only metric of security. It is a critical component for some things, but it is certainly not the only attribute. And one needs to look at the sensitivity of the data and the whole set of multi-factor security issues that protect data, and physical location is only one, and match the location, the security to, as Michael said, the dissemination and access and sensitivity of the data. And I think that's common sense, as he said, that would apply in any context. The related issue is one of how do we ensure that U.S. companies remain competitive in this space? Because I think all of us on the Commission felt that clouds are a place where the U.S. has an international competitive edge, and we want to work to identify those areas where we can continue to make sure that's the case. And so in the sense of saying, as we look at government data, if we want to be able to host the data of other governments in U.S. clouds, we need to lead by example. And we being the royal we, all of us, not just the government, need to lead by example. And so it's really being nuanced and understanding the nature of the workflow and the data and the expectation that we can't expect other governments to do for their non-sensitive data what we're not willing to do for our non-sensitive data.
Certainly not to break at the lowest common denominator. Okay, other questions?
Hi, Julianne Francis with Bloomberg News.
Yep.
Early on in the report, you make a comparison to the importance of cloud compared to the internet or the web. And I'm wondering, I'm kind of interested in the basis for that comparison, if you can talk a little bit about the analogy and based on the current situation, what led you to kind of make that comparison?
Well, the comparison is that here is I'll give you somewhat of a evolutionary answer here, and definitely phone a friend from some help from my colleagues. So we sort of have a little history lesson here. If you think about what the foundation back in 2003, 2004, when we were first able to make the internet real and broadly accessible, you had the foundation step was the broad adoption of IP networks. So when we said we were going to broadly adopt IP networks, we said we didn't have to know or care where the physical underlying infrastructure was underneath it, but by writing to an IP level, we then could make, the network available to lots of people, and every application developer didn't have to think about, well, gee, how do I write to that network? Pretty soon we didn't care where routers or switches are. We opened the network, which was followed by 3 to 4 years of incredibly rapid technological advancement. The extension of devices to the edge of the network, the movement of data, voice, and video over networks, broadband acceptance, and so that kind of blew out. The fundamental thinking of a cloud is you don't have to know or care where all the physical underlying components are. You don't have to know where servers, storage, or networks are, and you can write to a single layer, causing, again, an explosion of rapid adaptation of applications and another level of innovation. So you can see that not only just by adoption rates, but also just the underlying principles. And if you think about it, you don't have to know or care where all that hardware is. You don't have to write every application specific. It opens the world to a far greater usage. I mean, just think of the practical application of the cloud today. I mean, you're thinking of hundreds of millions of users on social networks that can, so the cloud is actually already here. The distribution of video. So the analogy we have, it's just the natural evolution of technology. The cloud is the output of 5 or 6 years of coming together, and so we don't have to know or care where the physical infrastructure is. And we do believe that it launches just another level of massive innovation and productivity. And by the way, one does not have to look around. You're probably all using dozens and dozens of cloud-based applications today. That's why you can buy an app for $2, right?
If I can add to that, Michael, I think I wrote the first draft of that particular paragraph, and it was much improved because of this collaborative process. But we had at least 4 different analogies in mind. The first was the web wasn't some niche application. It fundamentally changed the way we used IT, and the cloud will be similar. The second is that the real impact is not going to be in our industry, although this industry is going to be changed. The real impact of the cloud is going to be in all types of companies, all levels of government, and the nonprofit and academic sector as well. The third point was that the government was an early adopter of the web. And it was very important that the White House, the federal agencies, state and local governments got out there and started using the web to provide information to citizens. And that was a validation that that was a useful technology. And it generated a lot of buzz and pushed adoption faster in this country than almost any other country. But perhaps the most interesting analogy is that in the 90s, when the Congress and the White House were making policy for the web and for e-commerce, in many cases, they made a conscious decision not to do something. They didn't impose early restrictions on privacy or try to write a universal law on spam, or there were a lot of places where government did not take action. And that was very important because it allowed the private sector to come forward with multiple solutions to problems that citizens had, whether it was security, privacy, even spam. I mean, we've dealt with spam in many cases because of filters and technology, not because there's some law that's really been effective globally. So those were 4 different places we made the analogy, but the point is this is a very important seismic shift. It's as important as the web, if not more important, and it's developing at least as fast as the web did in the 90s.
I have one more point on that.
Oh, please.
So my colleagues gave excellent points, and there's one more to consider, which is, in fact, that it's web-scale computation. So the development of this kind of technology was driven by the kinds of scale that you've seen in the emergence of the internet. And what's really interesting about it, in fact, is the elastic computation. So you have sort of the scalability of your computation as a service. And so what's happened is as this was developed to address large audiences in the web, it's now being taken into other sectors and applications with a number of the characteristics that Mike pointed out, or the 2 Mikes.
Other questions? And Phil, if you had any remotely, we'd also like to address that audience if possible.
Thanks for letting me ask another question.
Yeah, you have a future as a financial analyst, right? It's a multi-part question.
You mentioned that you don't think the changes to procurement are needed. But I want to point out something. Vivek Kundra just recently made some comments that he said that we almost have an IT cartel within federal IT that's made up of very few companies that benefit from government spending because they understand the procurement process better than anyone else. It's not because they provide better technology. So he's very critical of how companies sell to the government. He says, you know, the incumbents have a huge advantage. They understand the process. Now, the cloud industry is producing a lot of new upstarts. I mean, Amazon is one of the most recognized companies. And so I don't quite get where you're saying where no changes to the procurement process are needed when you have the federal CIO saying that the current system is overwhelmingly favoring the big defense contractors, the big IT vendors, and it's really excluding the smaller and mid-sized companies from having a fair shot.
Okay, so let's back up here. We are not saying that we don't think that there's changes needed to the procurement. What we are saying is there have been through OMB 300 and a few other initiatives some movement to start to do reform and changes to that, and we encourage those to not only be extend out, to not only continue, but also to accelerate. There's no question, and it's a very practical thing. If you look at the traditional way that procurement is done within the federal government, it is in fact not only done to the incumbent supplier, but also to the incumbent technology, and there isn't a barrier to adoption of new technologies. If you want to buy a cloud service, but every benchmark is I bought a server, storage, network services, then I don't know what a unit of compute is, and yet you could, through the normal policies and practices, actually miss a whole generation. Secondarily is you'll notice that we have very clearly identified as a recommendation the process of adding incentives and other forms to allow those traditional procurement processes, people who are early adopters, not to sort of say, I save money, therefore I lose budget, but I save money there I can reinvest in other ways to provide incentives. So if I think you would break us down into 3 places. One is we do believe that procurement does need to change. We want to encourage the efforts that have been done to try to make those reforms, because some good efforts have started. And then we do think that not only that there has to be at the agency level, but across agencies, both changes in the procurement methods, but also in the incentives of what happens on the annual budget grant.
If I could add to that, I think the specific recommendation talked about federal acquisition regulations as opposed to the process of acquiring. And I think the issue early on, the question arose early on about whether there were fundamental problems in the acquisition regulations that made it difficult to buy as a service. And I think the conclusion of the Commission was that that wasn't necessarily an impediment, that the flexibility in the regulations existed for acquisition officials to be able to buy as a service rather than buying more traditional IT. And that, for example, we know that the traditional IT thinks about buying IT as capital, not necessarily as a service, and that the ability of vendors, large or small, to offer solutions sometimes depends on the extent to which they can recover their investment over the life of the contract. The federal acquisition regulations allow acquisition officials to structure contracts in a way to provide that ability and incentive for people to offer a solution as a service rather than a more traditional mode. So I think in the recommendation was really in the context of whether there are specific aspects of the regulations themselves that need to change, to which we don't believe that's the case. We believe it's more an issue of encouraging acquisition officials to take advantage of the flexibility in the regulations to buy as a service rather than a traditional model.
And the practices are the ones that need to change. By the way, Vivek himself, you know, when we had an opportunity to debrief with him, believed that this was one of the most fundamental ones, is that the practice itself had to change in the adoption, and then it was more the cross-organizational and also the annual budgetary process that needed to change.
Well, let me maybe pick up on that a little bit, because I think this point warrants discussion in the broad context of the report. In many ways, I think one of the ways you can view all of these recommendations is addressing the issues that arise when technological change drives and requires cultural change. And here, cultural change is in the nature of how one acquires and provisions service as opposed to facilities, which is what Mike was talking about. It relates to the culture about procurement, and it relates as well, it's not just about government, it's about providers too. The culture and process by which the providers engage with that, the way that they work with government to define those processes, companies large and small, the issues around security, around privacy, around transparency, are all about trying to create mechanisms and a dialogue to drive that change in culture that will lead to the uptake of that technology, both in government and in the private sector.
And that's why probably one of the last recommendations, one of the most important, is that we also focus on education. Other questions?
If I can just add to that point, Michael.
Oh, please.
It seems to me that as you look at the 14 recommendations, in many cases we're touching on issues that we've been working on for 20 or 25 years in internet policy. And in general, with the cloud, these issues like privacy and transnational data flow are now twice as difficult because it's more global, more people involved, more different issues, but they're 5 times more important because we're not just talking about communication, we're talking about computing. The good news, I think, in procurement is it actually becomes easier because buying services, buying these cloud services will provide more flexibility. We won't need so many rules and regulations that we have today for buying systems. It's a very different paradigm. It'll be much more akin to buying electricity, which is not something that generates huge stacks of rule books. But we have some real challenges here. The good news, I think, is the cloud is pushing us to take action to fix some things that have been broken for a long time.
Can I just add one thing to that, which is the innovation point that's come up a lot, that when all this infrastructure is out, a small operator can come with a good idea and he can scale up quickly. And that's tremendous. Before, he needed a lot of capital really to get in the game. And that also gives flexibility to the government folks where they might have a smaller idea but couldn't really do the big investment beforehand, but now they could demonstrate it and then scale it smoothly. It's a much faster research and product development cycle. So that's something to note as well.
Hi, my name's My name is Brendan Sasso. I'm with the Hill newspaper.
Yep.
And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the challenge of data security with cloud computing. And I see one of the recommendations is for a national data breach notification law, and I'm wondering what's important to be in that law, what shouldn't be in the law to ensure innovation within the industry, but still having trust from people. And I know that some of the Democrats want more privacy as part of the law, and Republicans want to focus on sort of financial information and whether that makes any difference for cloud computing.
Well, I think I will stay out of the which side is which, and kind of. So we're going to probably have multiple contributions here. So I'll make a quick opening comment, and then everybody else can jump in. At its foundational level, the issue of transparency in the reporting of breaches says is that a company who you trust to have the services should put up front what its operating procedures are, what metrics it has, what formulates and its capabilities. But whenever there's a problem, that it should be as forthright as possible in describing what it was, what happened, what the root cause was, and so everybody gains. And trust is about understanding. So this is again one of those common sense practices that says, if I know what you're measuring, I know how you measure it, and you give me what you measure, and when you have a problem, you tell me what it is, what you did to fix it, and what are you going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again. Well, again, law of common sense applying here. That's really the practice that's in place here, which is really no different to some degree than you would think about regulation in the financial industries or a big utility. So at its premise, that's what's important to do. Privacy comes as a question then of looking at the individual workflow and saying, for which workflow, what are you going to adopt to which policies, and being able then to have a policy driven that says under certain classes of applications, I'm going to apply one set of rules, and under a second set of applications, apply a different set of rules because they're not as important because it's more open data. And so again, the which ones at which place at what level, the technical detail is extensive, but the principles are pretty clear. And there's nothing more powerful than sort of saying, here's what happened and why it happened.
Yeah, I was going to draw an analogy with the lessons learned from product recalls, which is really you act expeditiously, you be completely transparent, and you take clear action rapidly. And that's really what this is saying, that if there is a breach, and some breaches are inevitable, that's the nature, nothing is absolutely secure, that one make that notification clearly and empower the individuals affected to take their own action as well. The other aspect, remember, in that recommendation that's also worth noting is empowering law enforcement and the providers of services to take action against those who are if it's a case of a criminal breach. There certainly can be cases where breaches occur due to accidents, malfeasance, or bad operating behavior. But there's another aspect of those issues of attacks on those facilities. And right now, many of our laws that would allow law enforcement to take action working with those providers, frankly, are antiquated. In fact, if you think about the penalties for penetrating one account versus 100,000 accounts, it's very hard right now to make clear criminal distinctions between those when, in fact, their effects on individuals are substantially different. And so the second part is empowering government as well as the cloud providers to seek remediation against the causes of those breaches in addition to the issues around notifying people of what happened.
John and Mike, do you have any comments?
I'd add one more thing to it. Again, it's on the learning loop. It's hard to fix something if nobody knows what it is. And so on the one hand, a cloud provider that's operating at a larger scale will see more problems and then be able to get the learning to work to make, to address the problems. But I think that's in that genre that we need a lot more of that from a security standpoint. But you can't necessarily have public airing of all classes of breaches because it can be detrimental at large. So there are certain kinds of areas that you have to be more careful with.
It also is incredibly important that the security breach legislation be designed properly. It would be very damaging if, for instance, cloud service providers were held liable for all the mistakes that their customers might have made in installing the software that they were running on the cloud, particularly for companies that are providing infrastructure as a service, which is like just renting people a computer to use. It doesn't make any sense to hold the cloud service provider for some software bug that was created by the customer, not by the cloud service provider. Likewise, if the cloud service provider were somehow required to notify all of a company's clients that there had been a problem, that doesn't make sense because they don't have the phone numbers and the addresses and the email addresses of all the people who are using a particular company's service that's running on the cloud. So we have to design these rules carefully. We certainly can do a better job than today, where we have different state rules that are in some cases not consistent, and we also need some kind of national, international answer to this problem as well.
So I just add one more thing to that, which is, it's an important technical question to get the allocation of risk and responsibility correct in the cloud. And so we need the policy sort of ideas first, and then we need the implementations to make sure that's true so that you have proper separation.
And of course, the integration of all things happens pretty tight. You also notice that we had reference to both the forensics and the discovery that actually went part and parcel to it. But it was actually fascinating to watch the depth of discussion on this topic among 300 very talented professionals who agreed on every point.
Luckily, we were using the cloud to collaborate.
Yes, absolutely.
Let me acknowledge our time restraints here. We're at the 1 hour mark. I want to add, for clarification on this last point, that the report talks about the importance of breach as a trust enabler across all IT systems, but that also will be of great benefit to a cloud architecture and delivery system. And also, just to observe very quickly that I think there is significant consensus on the Hill about how to approach data breach that's less about party and more about process in the two different chambers. We can talk more about that. A couple of notes before we adjourn. First of all, that many of our commissioners will be available to those of you in the press later if you have follow-up questions, but we wanted to stick to time schedule here. Others of our commissioners will be participating in a BMC-hosted panel discussion that starts next door at 3 o'clock. And last, and certainly not least, there have been a number of references to an army of professional colleagues who stood behind the commissioners in producing this remarkable work product. And I wanted to use this public opportunity to, in particular, call out a few of those. Elizabeth Grossman and Jim Rotsock at Microsoft, enormous effort. Dan Burton, a one-man gang at Salesforce. Thank you, Dan. Leif Ulstrup and the team, Eric Green and Carolyn Eichler at CSC. Emily Stempilia and Bob Wambach at VC in particular, many more, some I've no doubt forgotten to mention. Last and certainly not least, Chris Wilson from the TechAmerica Foundation staff and Jennifer Kerber, who really provided, I leaned on at least the most to provide real fuel for the effort, and she fueled that effort with her intelligence, with her energy, and with lots of Red Bull. So I wanted to say thank you publicly to them.
And I think we all want to collectively also pay tribute to Vivek Kundra for his somewhat visionary leadership in sort of starting this off. So, I mean, he did just a great job of thinking forward as well.
Great. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.